Okay, welcome. We're going to do a very quick tour of a fresh version 12 installation of the Foundry virtual tabletop. If you're following on the website, you'll have seen how we install the basic system on your own server or on your laptop or whatever. This will be very much the same sort of thing if you installed it on any of the other cloud services. So let's talk about version 12. The first thing to note is that we are on version 12 build 330. Version 12 has been out for a while now, and we are looking at a fairly stable system. There are a few add-ons, we'll get to that later, that are waiting to catch up, but hopefully by the time we get to that level of sophistication, they'll be ready. So for now, we're just going to go through Foundry Virtual Tabletop essentially from scratch. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to the main layout points and things you need to look at when you have a new installation. Okay, the very first thing you're going to need is a game system. Now, you can create your own game systems. I would recommend against doing that, especially if you're new. you really just want to install one. Now, we are focused in this series on Dungeons & Dragons 5e. I'm making this about 2 months before 2024 Player's Handbook is due out. So I can see that over the next sort of 6 months to a year, people will begin to transition to 2024, but at the moment, we'll just deal with 5e. So let's install a game system. The first thing to note is we've got three things at the top here. We've got the game worlds, we've got the game systems, and we've got the add-on modules. The thing we are interested in is game systems, which is where you'll be put by default the first time you log into a freshly installed system. We are going to be installing a system, so we select Install System. And at this point, we're being prompted for a package name. Now, this is a filter, so what we will do is just put D5E in the filter, and what we see here is the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This is the game system. Now, this has got an awful lot in it. It's got all of the basic rules and some basic content for us to play with. This is the, if you like, the foundation. This is the core part of creating adventures for our virtual tabletop. So let's just install that. This will take a few seconds. It will vary depending on where you are. You don't need to wait for it to finish. We can just close this and you can see the installation is going on in the background. Right, system D&D 5e was installed successfully, and you'll notice that it's now thrown me into Game World. So if I just quickly go back to Game System, you'll see here's our game system, D&D 5e. Okay, Game World, this is the next thing we need. So we've now got our system. If you like, this is like, for want of a better description, it's like buying the GM's Guide and the Player's Handbook. Okay, that's our game system. It's the basic core rules of the system. The next thing we need is a game world. Think of a game world as buying one of the module books or buying an adventure online. Okay, it is just the environment in which your adventure is going to take place. Now, in this case, we're not going to install a world. We are going to create one from scratch. So let's create a world. Okay. We need to give our world a title. This needs to be unique within our installation. So let's call this My First World. Now, first thing you'll notice is, although I've typed My First World in up here with the capitalization, down here it's been converted to lowercase and all the spaces have been replaced by dashes. The reason is that this is the data path where the data for our world will be put. If you're not interested in the internal workings of Foundation, you don't have to worry about it. If you are interested, I'll cover all of this aspect in more detail on a blog post. Okay, for now though, you don't need to worry about this. It's all set for you according to the title. The only thing you need to know is it needs to be unique. Okay, the next thing we need to do is select the game system. Well, we've only got one game system installed, so we will select Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Now, the rest of this we are going to leave for now. We'll come back to it. So here's our first world, okay? And it tells you that it was created on Monday, August 19th. It tells us the system we're using is D&D 5e, and this simply tells us that we're compatible with version 12, which you'd expect because we have just created it. Okay, this button here is the one that you really want, which is the Launch World button. So let's kick this world off. And after a little while, the reason for all of this stuff is it's setting up the data for version 12 because the D&D 5 system will also work for version 11. Don't need to worry about that. So you can see here, this is my first world, and we are now being invited to join the game session. Now, at this point, we've created a fresh world. The only user we have is the Game Master. So we select Game Master, and the password will just be blank. There will be no password set at this point. Okay, and you can see all these game details. This is where we missed out all of the information before about times and dates of sessions, the world description. We didn't bother typing anything in, so it's blank. So we just say, okay, let's join our game session. And here we are. This is what the interface will look like the very first time you log into a new world. Okay, so what have we got? Well, on the left side, you'll see we've got a set of tools. And we will go through each of those in more detail in later sessions. But for now, just note that we have got, what have we got? 3, 6, 9 tools. Okay, so there are 9 tools on the left-hand side. Down here in the bottom left corner, we've got a thing listing the players that are currently in our world. Well, obviously that's just the Game Master because only the Game Master is here. It's the only user we've got. Next to that, we've got what's called the macro bar. Don't worry about that right now. It's just a place where you can put actions and things that you want to do in the world, and it's just a nice, easy way of arranging things. Don't worry about that. We will classify that as advanced. In day-to-day gameplay, most people won't need it until they reach a certain level of sophistication. So, on the right here, you will see we have a panel that at the moment we're looking at the chat as indicated by these little bubbles. Okay, the chat is where you as the Game Master and your players will interact with one another. So even if you're using something like Discord or Zoom or whatever for your audio and your video perhaps of your sessions, this is where most of the interaction that you do will take place in terms of things like recording your dice rolls, and if your players want to communicate via chat and so on, they can do so through this interface. We'll get to that later. For the time being, it's just basically like any chat system you're used to. Right. Next to that, we might as well work across these right to left. Okay, so we just click on these with our left mouse button, and we've now switched to the combat. This is the combat panel, which is very useful for the Game Master, and will become useful for players as we go into combat. The next thing is scenes. So this is, if you like, the chapters of your story. Okay, so the different scenes, you will have different maps and different setups. We'll get to that We'll look at scenes shortly. Next thing we need is actors. These are your players and your NPCs. Okay, so your monsters and player characters. Next, we have items. So this is basically any item in your game. This could be a magic item. It could be more mundane things like swords or armor or flasks of oil or whatever. The next thing we've got is the journal. Now the journal, this will become from a game master's point of view, this is a very important one. This is where all the notes about your world are in your game world. For players, this can be something that the game master supplies to you. So background lore for the world, for example, could be put into a journal and made available to players. Or it could be that the players maintain their own journals. The next thing we've got is rollable tables. So, for example, as the Dungeon Master, I might have a rollable table for random encounters, for example. Some game systems use card stacks. It's less common in Dungeons & Dragons, but if we need them, they're here. Then we've got playlists. So this is where you put your playlist for your music that you want to play, or atmosphere, soundtracks, or special effects, or anything like that will be put in here. Then we come to compendium packs. Now, compendium packs. Right. Compendium packs are basically all of the above. So it's all of the actors, scenes, journals, items, and so on, except these are kept out of the game world directly. And so compendia are stored on the server, but they're not necessarily, well, they're not served to the end users, which keeps the size of your world down in terms of what players need to download in order to interact with the world. We'll cover compendia later. You can see here we've got a folder called D&D SRD content. This is put in there by the Dungeons & Dragons game system, and it's got some interesting things like character features, the items and spells from Dungeons & Dragons. It's got some monsters for you to start using, and it's got some starter heroes and some rules and tables for you to use. Okay, so we'll cover all of this later. Next thing is game settings, right? So the game settings, unsurprisingly, is all of the settings for your virtual tabletop. So the first thing to note is it's telling us that we've got Foundry version tabletop build. It's version 12. It's 330. It's considered stable. We've got no modules active, so that's 0. We've got D&D version 3.3.1 installed, and beneath that we've got a series of buttons so these allow us to access things like the configured settings for the core game rules, for any modules that we've got installed. Then we've got configure controls, which allows us to change the shortcuts that we use for the keyboard and so on. We've got a module management system, which allows us to turn modules on and off, and potentially to configure them and so on. The important thing about this is that this is to manage modules that are already installed on your server. So if we click on it now, you'll see that we have no modules. Okay, and there's nowhere here to install a module. You have to install the module on the settings page that we looked at before, and then you'll be able to activate it in individual worlds. Don't worry, we'll cover all of that shortly. Edit world. Remember when we were setting up the world, it offered us the opportunity to enter a description and so on. Well, that's all in here. So you can see here we've got the background image, we've got the page, the join page, which is the one about logging on and so on. We've got when the next session is going to be, and we've got the world description. We left all of that blank, but this is where we could edit it in the future. Next, we've got user management. Now, this is where you start adding your players. Okay, so this is your players. So at the moment, the only player we've got in our world is Game Master. Recall when we did. So the first thing you should do if your server is public facing, in other words, if it's on the internet, the first thing you should do is set a password for the Game Master. Because at the moment, despite these dots being here, there is no password. So we would set the password simply by typing it in. Okay, so that's it, set. The next thing we might want to do is we might want to create an additional user. So we'll create a player, player 2, and we would set them a password also. Okay, and now we have to set the user role. Now, normally you would simply leave it as player. However, you might have trusted players or an assistant GM. You may even have another game master. Basically, trusted player and assistant GM just allow you to have players with elevated privileges, so they're allowed to do a little bit more than a normal player could. We'll worry about that later. For now, we'll just have it set as a standard player. Okay, save and return, and it will reload our game. We can now come over here, and so this is our player landing page. So as a player, I'm offered the opportunity to join the game session, and I can see I can join as player 2. So I join as player 2, and I enter the password which my game master will have previously given to me, and I join the game. Okay, so as a player, the first thing I see is this user configuration, which allows me to select an avatar that will represent me, the player. Okay, so this player avatar, as it says, would be displayed if you're using the built-in audio and video chat, or there are certain modules that may want to use the player avatar to display information. We're not going to worry about that for the time being. We'll just leave it blank. The player color is simply the color that represents you in the interface. So if we look down here in the bottom corner here, you can see that we've got player 2 and we've got the color blue, which is this color that appears over here. Player pronouns. I will assume that you've had a session 0 of some description of where you would have discussed this if it's important to you that you refer to by particular pronouns, but this you can put in here, which allows you to remind people that you prefer a set of pronouns. The next thing is player character. Now, we have not created a player character yet, so we have no player characters available. But once you, as a player, have a player character, this is where you would select it so that it becomes your primary player character, the one that will be selected when you log in. Okay, save player configuration. Now we'll note some differences with the player interface. You'll notice over on the left, where the Game Master had 9 buttons, we have only 3. That's because the player doesn't need access to a lot of the controls that the Game Master does. The Game Master needs controls for actually creating the world and controlling it that the player doesn't need during play. The other thing to note is that over on the right here, you'll notice that we have, there's no scene button, which is available to the Dungeon Master. The other thing you'll notice is there are going to be differences when we look at what's in here. Yeah, you'll notice in the chat that you don't get the 2 introductory messages that the Dungeon Master or Game Master did. That's because those are specific to the Game Master. The only other setting that's interesting at the moment is this game setting over here. You'll notice that again there are fewer buttons. You don't have things like the user management or the module management, but you do still have some configuration settings for configuring your particular preferences for the way you want the interface to behave. Same with configuring the controls. It may be that you want to have different keys to do certain things within the interface. We'll talk about that later. Right, the only other thing that's interesting is if you are working on a smaller screen, let's say on a smaller laptop screen, you may want this out of the way most of the time, in which case this little triangle here allows you to collapse it down to just the essentials, and then you can open it up again when you need to refer to it. So that's basically it. Okay, that is the interface from both the game master's point of view and the player's point of view. Okay, coming back to be a game master again. What you'll notice here is that there is nothing in the world. It is blank. That's because we've not created anything in our world. Okay, the first thing we really need to do is to create a scene. So we go over here and we select the scenes, and we want to create a scene which will be either a map or simply an image. So commonly you would use a map for battle scenarios, and you might use an image for theatre of the mind, for example. We'll get into all of that later. For now, let's just create a scene, and we'll call this, let's call this Haunted House. Whoops, let's try and spell it correctly. Okay, so we've got the Haunted House. So we create a new scene called Haunted House, and we get this, which is the configuration. Just for now, let's just close this off. Okay, we're going to cover we'll cover everything over the course of the next few weeks, but for now, we'll just say once you've given it a name, that's sufficient for you to move forward. So let's save these changes. Right. So what have we got that's new? Well, first of all, we've got this over here, which says that we've got a haunted house scene. The next thing we can see is that up here we've got haunted house, and this is called the navigation bar, which allows us to navigate between scenes. The little target tells me that this is the active scene. Underneath it we can see letters in circles, and these are the relevant players. So we've got the game master, G, and we've got a player, P. All players will be P, but the point is that the colours will be the colours that the players have selected. So in this case, the player with blue is player 2. If I need reminding, down here in the bottom left-hand corner, I can see the list of active players, and I can see the game master is green, and the player next to him, there's the colour blue. So I know that that is player 2. The scene is currently this grey field with a grid over it. We'll talk about the grid, and we'll talk about the colour. Now, to zoom in and zoom out, I'll assume you've got a 3-button mouse. If you don't, then you're going to use the scroll wheel, or the scroll function on your laptop trackpad or whatever. I would certainly recommend getting a 3-button mouse. It makes your life so much easier. Okay, scrolling in, scrolling out. Just use the scroll wheel, wind it forward and backwards will allow you to scroll in and out. Right click and hold, and you can drag the scene about. So if you're focused in, you can still move around the scene. Okay, so come back out again. Left click is to select. Well, there's nothing on the field at the moment, so we can worry about that later. Just while we're here, you also notice you've got this big game pause down the bottom. This is basically the game master's control of the game. Once you pause the game, the main thing is that your characters can no longer move their tokens around on the battle map or whatever. We'll cover pausing games and controlling the game later. Okay, so that's cool. We now have effectively a blank map that contains nothing of any interest. If we go back and look at this from a player point of view, you can see that I can see nothing. It's black dark. Okay, and that's because I don't have anything on the map to do the seeing. I can see that it's the haunted house. I can see that it's the active because it's got the target. I can see the game master and the players on the field, but I can't actually see the map. Okay, and that's because, as I say, there's no light on the overall scene, and there's no token to actually see the light. So let's fix that now. Let's come back to our game master interface, and what we're going to do now is we're going to create a new actor. Now, rather than create one from scratch, okay, which would involve a little bit of work, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of the pre-made heroes that's provided by the Dungeons and Dragons standard content. So here it is, Dungeons and Dragons SRD standard reference document content. Okay, and here you can see starter heroes. This is one of those compendiums. Okay, starter heroes is a compendium. So let's open that up. Okay, and we get a list of starter heroes. And we can allow our players to choose from these. Okay, let's take this elf ranger. Okay, so take a look at him. You can see that this is the image that's going to be used. These are his stats. We'll cover the player sheet in more detail later, but basically this is the player's character sheet. Okay, so let's close that up, and now we'll take this elf ranger, right click and import that entry. Okay, now we can close this compendium, we don't need it anymore. So we've now got this player character, and you'll notice it's appeared in the actors. Okay, so now we have this actor. Now that's brought in an actor. An actor is a player character, a monster, NPC, whatever, that you want to interactive with on the Foundry VTT. So coming back to our player now, let's go and look at our actors. Oh, we don't have any actors. Why don't we have an actor when we can see one over on the Dungeon Master screen? It's very simple. We don't have any actors that are assigned to us. We don't have any control over these actors. These actors only appear to the Dungeon Master unless otherwise explicitly controlled by a player. So let's right click on this, and if you go down you can see configure ownership and left click, and now we can see the ownership, and we're going to give the player 2 complete ownership of this actor. Okay, so let's save the changes, and now when we go across to player 2 you can see that under the actor tab we have the elf ranger, and if I now click on it I can see the character sheet. Cool. Okay, so I've got an actor. Why is it that I still can't see anything on the screen? That's because my actor, my character, is not standing on this scene. I, the player, am on this scene, okay, and I, the player, have control of this actor, but it's not on this scene. So one might think, okay, well, we'll take this and we'll put it on the scene. The problem is you as a player don't have the rights to do that. So let's go back to our game master. Okay, and our game master can take this, okay, left click and hold, drag it out, and we can drop him right in the middle of our scene. So there he is. There's our, how would you say that, Quilath? Quilathe? You could pick away. Quilath, the elf ranger. Okay, and he's standing right in the middle. Okay, back to our player. Look at this. We can see something. Okay, now this is the area that our character can see. Okay, because our character is an elf, he can see 60 feet in any direction in the dark because he has dark vision, and that's what this represents. Okay, so now I have, as a player, I have control over an actor, this Quilath. Okay, that character, or that actor, is represented by this token. Okay, think of it as a miniature. Okay, it's represented by this token on the scene that we are currently playing in. I know it's the current scene because it's active. It has this bullseye. Okay, now I can move this token around. Okay, I could if I didn't have the game paused. Now, because the game's paused, I can't move this token. Okay, if I try to, I get this, you cannot take this joke, well, the game is currently paused. So, back to being the Dungeon Master. Now, because the Game Master, Dungeon Master, is all-powerful, I can move this character wherever I please. Okay? Now you'll notice something. I moved him 5 feet, which is these one grid square. Okay, I moved him 5 feet to one side, and now my circle of vision has moved with me, and I've got this grey crescent shape. Okay, this is called the Fog of War. As you explore a map at your Dungeon Master's choice, okay, you may be able to remember, quote unquote, remember what you have seen so far, and that's what this grey area represents. Okay, when we put a map under here, you'll be able to see part of the map under this grey area. Coming back to be a player, we can see our token is at the center of the bright circle. That's what we can see right now. The grey area represents part of the map that we have been to before, whether it was us there moving there or the Dungeon Master. Okay, let's undo this. So let's free up our character to move. So I press the space bar. As the Dungeon Master, I press the space bar, and you'll notice game paused has disappeared. The game is now live. It's active. Players can interact with it. So coming back to our player, I can now move by dragging it, left mouse click, hold it, drag it where I want, and I can move my token around the map. Alternatively, I can use the cursor keys, and I can move one square at a time using cursor keys. Okay, so I can go to the left, I can go up, I can go down, I can go to the right. Okay, so I can choose. I can either use the keyboard to move around, or I can drag and drop my character, and the character will then move. Okay, so I drag it, let go of the mouse button, and the character will then carry out the actions. So far, so good. Next thing to note. This scene is called the Haunted House. Now, as the Game Master, I may not want the players to know that this is a haunted house. So, coming back to being the Dungeon Master, going to my scene, I right click and I choose Configure. Now you see here, Haunted House. Okay, I could just change this. Okay, if I change this name here to just House, for example, and save the changes, it now says House. It's House on my list of scenes, and my players see House. The problem is that as a Dungeon Master, I may want these scene names to actually be meaningful to me. Okay, so for example, I might want to call it Scene 1, Haunted House. Okay, so it's now called Scene 1 Haunted House, but you'll notice it says Scene 1 Haunted House up here. And my players see it as Scene 1 Haunted House. Not really very nice. And besides which, I want to conceal the fact that it's haunted. So I right click on it, I choose Configure, and now I can change this navigated name. Okay, so if I now choose that to be House on the Hill, okay, and I say save that change. So now, in my list of scenes as the Dungeon Master, which I may very well use to actually organise my scenes into some kind of narrative order, or I may choose to have some of them as archive material, others will be there for the length of the adventure, whatever, doesn't matter. I can name them convenient to me as the Game Master, but over here on the navigation it says House on the Hill, and if I go and look at it as a player, it similarly says House on the Hill. So now my players see the name that makes sense to the players, whereas I, the Dungeon Master, have control where I can say, yes, it's the Haunted House. Cool. Okay, the next thing is the game master, and this will be the last thing we'll cover in this video. Let's say I create another scene, okay, and I'll call this to be O2, let's call this the cemetery scene. And I think that's how you spell cemetery. My operating system thinks otherwise. Is it cemetery or cemetery? Oh, yeah, cemetery. There we go. Okay, so create a new scene. Okay, so we've got the same thing. Okay, we've got O2 cemetery. I may very well want to just call it cemetery as far as the player's concerned. Okay, now you'll notice here that it says show in navigation, tick, GM only. All right, so let's save that change. What does that mean? Well, down this side here are all the scenes in my world. Okay, irrespective of whether I'm using them at the moment or not, they're actually in the world. This is my navigation bar. Okay, I can navigate by either. I can choose to navigate by this, or as the Dungeon Master, I can navigate by this, or I can navigate by this. Okay. Now, I can see House on the Hill, and it's got the little target telling me it's the active scene. And I've also got Cemetery, okay, which is the other scene. If I click on Cemetery, it loads the cemetery scene. You'll notice that I, the Dungeon Master, am now on the cemetery scene, the little G. The player is still on the active scene, House on the Hill. Okay? You'll notice that the player's token has disappeared. That's because we're on a different scene. Coming over as the player now, all I notice is that the Game Master has disappeared. He's no longer got a G on House on the Hill, but the player token is still there. So the player is interacting with scene House on the Hill. The Game Master is currently looking at the cemetery. Cool so far. Okay, let's go back to House on the Hill. All right, so I click on House on the Hill, and now the Game Master is back on House on the Hill, and the player sees the Game Master has reappeared. A G is on House on the Hill. Excellent. Now then, let's go and take a look at that setting again. So right click on Cemetery, select Configure. Show in navigation. Now, as the Game Master, I will always be able to see these scenes listed under my Scene tab. If I've got a lot of scenes, this bar up here, the navigation bar, is going to become very, very crowded very quickly. Okay, so if I say, okay, don't show it in the navigation and save the change, okay, this scene is no longer visible up here in the navigation. It's just in my scenes. I can still get to it. I can still right click on here and choose View Scene, and now I'm viewing it and it appears on my navigation because I'm actually on it. I'm looking at it right now. I can go back to the House on the Hill and it will disappear because I'm no longer on it. All right. So let's go back and do Configure. Okay, Show in navigation. Okay, now you'll notice it says Show in navigation GM only. That's because I can see it as the Game Master up here, but as the player, I can't see Cemetery. In play, this might be what you want to set up at the beginning of a session. Okay, you might want to be able to, you might want to just look at this and say, okay, all of the scenes that I'm likely to play, I'm going to just put up here on the navigation bar. It's a convenient place to put them. But obviously, I don't want my players necessarily to be able to see more than one scene. However, there are circumstances under which I might want my players to see more than one scene and allow them to switch between the two scenes. Case in point, I might have made available to my players a landing page which contains things like summary access to their journals and lore and so on, that I don't want necessarily to have them clicking around on the interface to try and find. They can just flip to the scene, refer to the information they need, and then flip back to whatever we're playing. So I might want to make House on the Hill and Cemetery available to my players. In that case, I would right-click, Configure. Okay, and now I would say show in navigation, yes, all players. Save changes. Okay, so as the Dungeon Master, Game Master, nothing's changed. I can still see this cemetery. But as the player, I can now see House on the Hill and Cemetery. Okay, so that's cool. Okay, so now I can decide whether or not players get to see this. Let's configure and take it away from the players again. So let's say no, GM only, save. So now as the Game Master, I can see House on the Hill and Cemetery in my navigation bar. As the player, I can only see House on the Hill. So far, so cool. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this first session. We've covered the basics of setting up a player, associating them with an actor. The actor is the quote-unquote player's character, player character. Then we've allowed that player character to have a token in a scene. Okay, and the token is essentially a representation of the actor. Okay, so the actor is the player character, the player sheet, if you will, the player character sheet. Okay, whereas the token is a miniature. It's a representation of that token on our scene. Then we've covered the basics of creating multiple scenes and managing the navigation at the top so that players can see it or not see it, and us being able to switch between it as the Dungeon Master. Just before we go, we'll cover one more thing. And that is, you remember we were talking about an active scene. Okay, the active scene is the scene that the players are actually playing on right now. In this case, House on the Hill. We've got a little target. I can, however, right-click on Cemetery and I can say Activate. Okay, and this will move the active scene to be the cemetery. So I can say Activate. Now, you'll notice two things. Okay, the first thing, the little target has moved. The cemetery is now the active scene, the one on which we are focused. The G and the P have both moved to the cemetery. This confirms to me that the Game Master, myself, and the player, in this case player 2, are now active on the cemetery scene. Okay, let's go and look at what's happened to player 2. So, player 2's gone dark. Okay, you can see there is the cemetery. It is active because it's got the little bullseye. We've got the G and the P, Game Master and player. But the player doesn't have a token on this scene at the moment. So it's completely black. The quote-unquote fog of war is hiding the scene. So this is the difference between the actor and the token. The actor is still there. The actor's still there. It's still active. Okay, the player can click on it. They can look at the character sheet. But the actor has no representation of this scene. Okay, it's up to the Dungeon Master to place a token on this scene so that the player can see. Now, there are several ways of doing this. Okay, they could take the token from the first scene and move it to the second scene and so on. However, what they can do is just take this, left click, drag it out, drop it onto the scene. Okay, this token now represents this character on the cemetery scene. So if I now come across and look at the player again, you can see that we've got a token sitting on the scene, and we've got the circle representing where we can see. Okay, so the player now has the Quillith Elf Ranger character actor is now represented by this token on the cemetery scene. Now the good thing about doing it this way is that this token is associated with this player. Sorry, with this actor, and the actor is associated with the player. If I now switch back to the haunted house, so I right click and I activate it, you'll notice that the token still sits on this scene. So House on the Hill now has the G and the P on House on the Hill. if I look back as the player, you'll notice that I'm now looking at the scene and I can see where I investigated the house on the hill, and the grey area is showing me that. I've got the token, I've got the vision, I can see the house on the hill. This token is associated still with that character. Okay, in fact, if I double click on it, it opens up the Elf Ranger character sheet. Okay, coming back to being the Game Master again, I can right click, activate the cemetery. Okay, now I'm on the cemetery, come back, I can now see the cemetery scene, double click on this and I can still see my character sheet. Okay, so hopefully that makes it clear the difference between the token, which is the representation on the scene of the actor, okay, and the actor is this character sheet containing thing which is owned by the player. We'll talk about some more complicated setups with actors and players and tokens and so on, but that's the basics. Okay, cool. I think we'll call that it for this session.